everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Rob Downey. I'm a physician at South Peninsula Hospital Functional Medicine Clinic. And just really glad to get to have a chance to talk with everyone about functional medicine. We had a lot of fun first time from reports we heard. So we're looking forward to doing that again. I'm a board-certified family practice physician, and I'm also certified in functional medicine by the Institute for Functional Medicine. My team also includes Christina Blandford, an RN, who will be certified as a functional medicine coach in July from the Functional Medicine Coaching Academy. And Carol Comfort, who's our patient services expert, also will be certified as a coach in July. I wanted to let you know a little bit about South Peninsula Hospital Functional Medicine itself. It's a clinic, an outpatient clinic of the hospital, and all of the insurance that's accepted by the hospital, anything that you would expect about seeing an MD applies to seeing me and getting work through our clinic. So last time around there were some questions and concerns about what it would be like to work with us or what you could expect, and we just wanted people to know the notes get done the same way, the billing happens the same way, so in the eyes of the system it's just like you're seeing a family practice doctor. Supplements are part of functional medicine. They're not critically necessary. They certainly can help a lot of the time, and we do make professional grade supplements available to our patients at cost. Wanted to show you our website. So you can get here just via South Peninsula Hospital Functional Medicine as a browser search, or the website listed on my card. And so as you can see, Christina there is taking you into functional medicine. And then a couple of important things about the website itself. There's a link to the Institute for Functional Medicine. You can see it down under patient resources. And then there's some free e-learning for those of you that are kind of like me, you like to geek out on this stuff. You can actually go do free learnings from the Institute for Functional Medicine. So that's really fun if you find these concepts interesting and you want to drill down more into them. If we can go back to our website, this is a TED-Med from Mark Hyman. Those of you that were here last time got to participate in that. That's available to anyone who'd like to spend 17 minutes learning more about functional medicine from one of the best, Mark Hyman, the chairman of the Institute for Functional Medicine. Also, our website has frequently asked questions like, do you accept insurance? How do I set up a visit? Etc. All right, can we transition to the tree, please? So one thing to be aware of tonight is that we're going to, again, have concepts coming up that have to do with, when we're talking about the adrenals, then in the sort of conventional allopathic care world, what we'd be thinking about is sort of the organ systems, the adrenal glands or the brain. You can get to this functional medicine tree on the Institute for Functional Medicine website, or you can come up and look at this one that we have later on in the evening. But what we'll be talking about are what are these underlying areas of behavior that drive these kinds of things. What's happening in the environment? What are our genetic predispositions and genetic expression? What are antecedents, triggers, and mediators that affect these manifestations as they come up through these different sort of nodes of function in the body that lead to signs and symptoms? And the point of the functional medicine tree is that it all matters. So functional medicine isn't trying to include or exclude any particular part, but instead incorporate all of it for patients' benefit. All right, so let's shift into the adrenals and stress and anxiety. all of you hopefully have a survey card, and please know that we rely on your responses in the survey cards to know whether or not we're serving your needs. That's our goal. Also, please be aware tonight's topic was chosen because those of you that filled out survey cards last time told us that's what you wanted this time. So I did have a community member approach me about an hour ago and ask why we weren't doing the Cleveland Clinic Grand Rounds on reversing dementia with functional medicine. And when we looked over that video again, the technical aspect was kind of over the top, and we felt like it wouldn't be a terribly friendly topic, and it'd be better if we cleaned it up a bit and made it more accessible. So we'd be happy to do that topic in the fall, where we prepare the concepts ourselves for you. So, why don't zebras get ulcers? It sounds pretty self-explanatory that, of course, zebras don't get ulcers, but when you reflect on it a little longer, it's a fairly big deal because they're out there wandering around on the Serengeti with no resources other than one another, and they have to get by all day, every day, every season, and they're constantly being hunted. So it's a pretty good setup for an ulcer. And the reason that they don't get ulcers is that they are aware that there are threats, and they have a system for sort of prioritizing when they should be eating, relaxing, mating, hanging out, drinking water, and when they should be wary and running away. And they spend a lot more time on the first items than the last items. So this concept isn't ours or functional medicine's necessarily. This author, Robert Sapolsky, is he is a biologist at Stanford. And if you're interested in the book, I've had the book spoken of very highly by quite a number of functional medicine experts that I trust. I have not read it myself. Basically, the reviews indicate that it's fairly technical, but definitely written for the lay public if you're interested in drilling down more into the physiology of how all this works. So the key idea tonight is going to be to ask ourselves, okay, so what is it that we can do as people to deal with things in the world and our lives that we sort of grow to treat as lions and be healthy, happy, and vital rather than stressed out. So the next issue is, what is stress? And to understand this, we need to go back a little bit. Hans Selye is an endocrinologist, meaning a specialist in hormone function, and he died in 1982. And partway through his career, he's the one that defined the stress response. And this hadn't really been terribly well described before Selye, and so he's the one that showed that there's this cortisol and adrenaline released, and the body's resources are mobilized, and then there's this sort of after period, as it were, of either a return to normal or exhaustion. Now, now when Hans Selye laid all of this out, when he was talking about exhaustion, he was talking about an organism being terrifically stressed over a very short time period of hours or days. And what we'll be talking tonight about is more of the chronic stress exhaustion type picture. But just be aware, when this was first all laid out, this is the way Selye described it for all of us. And this was very illuminating in terms of setting the stage for later understanding chronic stress. And so there's this idea of the stressor or threat, whether it's us or a zebra, and we go into what's called fight or flight mode, and we quit worrying about what we were going to read or, again, which watering hole we were going to go to, and we either run away or we bare our fangs and fight. Cortisol is released. We're going to talk a lot about that tonight, and then adrenaline, which many of you are familiar with. And then the situation resolves and we return to normal. or we stay highly stressed to the point of, in the case of some organisms, complete exhaustion and death. And then we know now that chronic stress has a tendency to lead to exhaustion as well. One really key thing before we move on from this slide, and perhaps one of tonight's most important concepts, is this idea of conflating the stressor, whatever it is that's stressing us, with the stress response. And so conflating means to confuse one thing with another. And so think about how many times we ourselves or somebody we know says, I'm stressed out because of my dog, or I'm stressed out because of my job, or I'm stressed out because I didn't get enough sleep. And these stressors are legitimate. They're clearly a really big deal. But what data is showing now, and what also is common sense, is that when the locus of control, meaning when we have a sense of empowerment and understanding around these issues rather than them pushing us around, that's part of making headway on the issue. And so as obvious as it sounds, when we say my dog is stressing me out and we really believe it, then we're giving the locus of control to the dog. Mm-hmm. And when we say the dog's barking, it needs to go out again, it's sick, I'm really tired, it's one of the first steps toward getting on top of it by saying that's the stressor, but the stress response is internal to me. That's my stress response. It's my accountability, and I can choose what to do with it. And so just that idea of parsing out what's really going on with stressors versus the stress response includes recognizing there are hundreds and thousands of stressors over the course of a lifetime, but the stress response is ours. It's our accountability, for better or worse. And as we talk about mindfulness later, one of the reasons we're going to focus on mindfulness tonight is one of the best ways to get on top of stress and adrenal issues and anxiety is because mindfulness practices essentially are, amongst other things, ways that we're automatically taking the locus of control back into ourselves, because we're becoming aware of what's happening in our bodies and we're becoming aware of what's happening outside of us, and we're letting go to some degree of these sort of inaccurate concepts that we're getting pushed around by life or life circumstances. So this is kind of how the system is set up in terms of that physiology we've been talking about. And you've got me to thank for the artwork, for better or worse. So up top there is the brain, and then I've labeled the frontal cortex, which is the part that's meant to be running the show. That's the executive function. And I've also labeled the midbrain, which is the hypothalamus and amygdala. And I've just used an arrow to show the nerves that connect the brain down to the adrenal glands. And right on top of either kidney, you have these little glands called the adrenals. Adrenal just means above the renal area, the kidney. And so the adrenals sit right there on top of the kidneys. And when we're stressed or chronically distressed, then the midbrain says to the adrenals, hey, it's time to release adrenaline and cortisol. This is the fight or flight response as we've talked about, and it's run by a part of the nervous system. It's called the autonomic nervous system. You could think of it as the automatic nervous system. This is not under your conscious control. This is a really old part of physiology, and so this is running your breathing, keeping your heart beating, manipulating your blood pressure up and down. So this is a very primitive, primal, old part of us. And we're going to talk at the end about how one of the brakes that you can get access to also is part of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic, or calming down, restorative side of the autonomic. But we're going to start out by focusing on the sympathetic part of the autonomic. Keep that up for one more second here. So remember that adrenaline, which many of you are familiar with, it has the job of going out during one of these necessary events. And by the way, I'm not critical of this the system we're talking about tonight. So the point is to have your fight or flight system work when you want and need it. You're being chased by a brown bear. You have a close call in traffic. You want this system to kick in. You want the adrenaline to reallocate your resources to seeing clearly, having quick response time, the nerves and blood vessels hogging all the fuel in the body, not sending any blood flow to the gut, not worrying about other issues for a while. So adrenaline kicks up blood pressure and heart rate. One of the things adrenaline does is it shifts blood flow away from the gut. And if you think about folks that are chronically stressed out, think about how many of them tell you they don't get along with their gut. And it turns out that's part of chronic stress, is that this extra fight or flight hormone soup that's floating around in those of us that have allowed ourselves to become chronically stressed is to some degree depriving our gut of that relaxed state for good digestion and blood flow. Cortisol is also released acutely during these events, and metabolically cortisol's job is to kick blood sugar up so that you've got fuel and to block insulin. And insulin's job is to push sugar from the blood into the cells so it gets burned. And that's going to happen to some degree regardless. Cortisol blocking insulin is basically taking the strategy that you want to make sure there's plenty of blood sugar in case one of these chases by a lion persists or what have you. And again, in terms of trying to connect the dots, if you think about individuals that are chronically stressed who tell you they can't get on top of that weight loss they were hoping for, then be aware as we let our cortisols run unchecked over the years, we're blocking insulin, becoming insulin resistant, which we don't want. One other thing you might find interesting about cortisol is that it tends to suppress the immune system. So people who tell you they're stressed out and they get one cold after another, a lot of the time in functional medicine, we really encourage those people to get on top of their adrenal and stress issues. And also the hippocampus, which is the memory center of the brain, tends to be a little blunted by undue levels of cortisol. So people who tell you they're stressed out and their memory's a little shot, same issue. All right, so what we want to do now is say, okay, acute stress, this is fine. When you have a serious event, then you shift back to nice, peaceful state without undue levels of cortisol and noradrenaline. You're good to go. What we don't want is to be chronically stressed, distressed. So I think we can just leave that slide up, but we want to talk about then what I think of as the lion factory. If we continue with this analogy that we're zebras, and there's these lions out there, and we want to know that they're there, acknowledge them, deal with them when they're really a threat. And the rest of the time, we want to be in a fairly peaceful state and say, well, that's life. There's lots of threats around. How do we do that? How do we achieve that? And so what are the lions in our lives? Contemporary 2017 citizens of North America and Alaska, well, it's the same for almost all of us. It's money, it's responsibility, it's relationship, it's our health, it's food, it's shelter, it's whether or not we do or don't have those things, or we worry about whether we're going to have those things, or people we care about. And I promised tonight to talk about anxiety, but I should acknowledge anxiety is sort of its own topic. And in all fairness, it's not the best to pigeonhole it and say that anxiety is just this state of worry that goes with kind of having the midbrain in charge and the adrenals on overdrive. But that's the part we're going to talk about tonight. I absolutely want to acknowledge some people and some families have a genetic tendency toward anxiety. Some people have been through terrible things that generate a lot of anxiety over time. Anxiety can be imbalances in the brain as it can't generate as much serotonin as it needs to over the years. So anxiety is a big topic in its own right, but for tonight's purposes, anxiety is the flavor of this feeling of the midbrain running the show more, and the adrenals being kicked in a little bit, too much of the time, most of the time, and again, how we can settle that down and get on top of it. So one thing to know is that the the midbrain is not meant to be in charge. And we talked about this at the first functional medicine presentation as well. So that frontal cortex is the executive function center of the brain, and it's fully capable of saying, the lions are currently 500 yards away and they're sleeping. This is a good time not to worry. When you put the midbrain in charge, the midbrain says, well, they're lions. They could still kill us. I mean, they're right there. So the midbrain isn't really meant to be in charge because the midbrain's job is to freak out. Another key concept that comes up here, and this comes up in neurology all the time, which is the function of the brain, is what fires together, wires together. And this is talking about these nerves in the brain. So when nerves are used and talk to one another, then the nerves form more robust connections. They talk to one another more frequently, and those nerves tend to take over. And nerves that don't get used then don't wire together as much, and they sort of sag or get wimpy or droopy or less robust. And so one of these things that comes up is if the frontal cortex is running the show 99% of the time and the midbrain's only in charge 1% of the time, you're pretty good to go. If you let your midbrain run the show most of the time, all day, every week, every month, every year, then you get a very robust midbrain that's activating a lot of these fight or flight chemicals. And this is just a fires together, wires together phenomenon. And so we want to be aware that the part of the brain that we're encouraging tends to take over, and the farther we get into that hole, the longer it takes to get out of it. All right, we'll take a brief tangent here. We've got to switch gears, and we need to talk about cortisol steel, which is our next slide. So we've been talking about cortisol and the fact that it's made by the adrenals, and there's a parent hormone in the body called pregnenolone, and it's made from cholesterol, and its job is to be turned into all of the steroid hormones you know and recognize: cortisol, progesterone, testosterone, estradiol, estriol, estrone, on and on. So just be aware that there's only so much of that pregnenolone around. And if you make enough cortisol and not too much, you have plenty left to make DHEA. And then DHEA turns into testosterone and the 3 estrogens, which matters whether we're men or women. So men make estrogen, women make testosterone, and all of us have balances of these hormones present in the body, and they're part of feeling well. And then DHEA itself, if you look this up on your own, you'll find that it's sort of referred to as the vitality hormone or the wellspring of life hormone. So part of feeling well from an adrenal perspective is having enough cortisol rather than too much or too little. And another part of feeling well from an adrenal perspective is having plenty of DHEA around. And the term cortisol steel means those adrenals that are freaking out because the midbrain's in charge, they're stealing too much of the pregnenolone to make too much cortisol. Thus, there's not enough left to make DHEA. All right, so now we're going to switch into how the adrenal functions itself. So here's normal adrenal function, and on the left you can see a little bar showing cortisol. And down at the bottom there you can see a little time bar going left to right. So at 8 in the morning, cortisol levels are high on a normal day. At lunch, they're still fairly robust. By dinner, they're dropping. And at bedtime, they're almost undetectable. And when we talk about adrenal problems tonight, what's called adrenal dysfunction, meaning sort of a misbehaving or unhappy adrenal gland, we're not talking about a medical diagnosis like Cushing's disease, which is cortisol off the chart all the time due to an adrenal tumor. We're also not talking about Addison's disease, which are people that are born with no adrenal capacity at all, or who end up in that situation. We're talking about imbalances or functions in the body which have consequences, but not the sort of thing that there'd be an ICD-10 code or that you'd see an endocrinologist for. So the adrenals, we've been talking about what the adrenals do in a stress situation, but the good news is what you want your adrenals to do 99% of the time, is their master regulatory function, which is to release cortisol in the morning to get some blood sugar out into the bloodstream, tell the liver to make and release a little more blood sugar to get rolling, and then over the course of an average day, lunch, dinner, bedtime, that's drifting off, and your adrenal is starting to get ready to make melatonin so you can sleep that night. And then you can see at the bottom, I've just made a little bar to show you also in normal adrenal function, you're going to have plenty of DHEA around because there's enough pregnenolone to make cortisol and DHEA if you're a happy, healthy person. So, wanted you to know briefly while we have this, where does this information come from, and a couple key principles. Your adrenal function is basically the same every day. So your adrenal, as a master regulatory organ, has to kind of say, all right, this is the way every day is going to be. We're going to release this much cortisol today, and we're going to do it tomorrow, next month, next year. If you change from being a Wall Street stock trader to relaxing on the beach every day, your adrenal function is going to change, but not right away. It's going to change over months and years. This is really important because when we get these cortisol tests on people, if your adrenals were changing wildly day to day and how much cortisol they release, we couldn't take one of these snapshots called a cortisol profile and get a lot of information about how your adrenals are working. Thankfully, the adrenals are really entrained. They kind of do the same thing every day. And so when we get one of these saliva snapshots of what your adrenals are doing, if you ever have it tested, it tells us a lot about the way the adrenals are functioning every day. The other thing to know is that we do these tests on saliva. If we were going to get these cortisol levels from the blood to look at a patient's morning, midday, dinner, and bedtime cortisol, we'd have to stick them 4 times. And it turns out that the psychological and psychiatric community for decades now in taking care of individuals that are in these institutionalized settings where their problems have led them to end up in an institution. This has been a big concern for many years for the healthcare professionals that take care of those folks, what their cortisol is doing, and it's been very clearly determined that saliva cortisols and blood cortisols are very, very accurate. And so thankfully we can get this information from cortisol very accurately. And as long as it's not a day that you got a letter from the IRS or you took a big exam or your dog died, it's going to be a pretty good day to get a cortisol profile. So we're going to continue on into what's called stage 1 adrenal dysfunction. So this is an individual who's got kind of the midbrain running the show, and this is a lot of us. This is me over the years. I told you all last time that part of why I wanted to become a functional medicine doctor is so I could justify trying to be less stressed myself, practice what I preach. And certainly can tell you during my medical training, I'm sure my cortisol was up there or higher all day, every day. So what we're talking about is over months and years, if we're kind of treating life like a lion hiding out there in the bushes, then we'll release this extra cortisol over the course of the day. So when we see this cortisol picture come back on somebody's cortisol profile, we call it stage 1 adrenal dysfunction. Stage 1 meaning this person is drifting into adrenal fatigue. And the key thing here is to know is that a lot of people, when they hear about adrenal fatigue, they think, oh, well, that means my adrenal is kind of giving out. But actually, about 95% of what we see are people that are kicking out too much cortisol. So as we talk about stage 3, I'll share a little bit more about that with you. And these folks, they are tired, but in terms of kind of their physiologic picture, they're wired. Their DHEA is okay, and it's like having the throttle sort of too wide open all the time. All right, let's go ahead and move on to stage 2. So in stage 2, over months and years, what will happen is that cortisol steel kicks in, and then there's just not enough pregnenolone left to make enough DHEA. And these people tell you they're getting really tired. Why? Because that wellspring of vitality hormone pool is dropping, and they're getting into hormonal derangements with their sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. Now there's not enough DHEA around to make that, so they'll tell you their cycle's messed up, their sex drive is dropping off, their muscle mass is going down. And then let's take a look at stage 3. And so when a lot of folks hear about adrenal fatigue, they think, oh, well, this must be what I have. I've heard about this. This is where my adrenals just, I've been stressed for a long time, and my adrenals just give out. But thankfully, we don't see this much in the functional medicine clinic. We don't get this cortisol picture back of a person whose actual cortisol itself is in the toilet and their DHEA is low. And I can tell you the really poignant part as a physician is the people I take care of who have this, they're hardly getting out of bed. It's really a tough situation. It doesn't mean that it can't be turned around, but they've progressed through those first two stages over months and years, and they've gotten to the point the adrenal's really given up the ghost. Again, about 95% of the cortisol profiles we get back have high cortisol, which is easier to turn around because you're in the earlier innings of where this is all going. So let's transition into the relaxation response. So we talked about the stress response, and now we're going to fast forward to a guy named Herb Benson at Harvard. And he's still alive, and right now he's the head of the Benson Henry Institute on the Harvard campus. It's about 8 stories. It's all glass and steel. And if you go to the Benson Henry Institute, you'll think, wow, this is just another state-of-the-art aspect of Harvard, and how great it must have been to be this guy and learn about the relaxation response. It turns out, though, that Herb Benson had a really hard go of it because he started this work back in the 1970s as an MD physician at a hospital affiliated with Harvard. And he thought, these Tibetan monks, they don't seem stressed out. They seem relaxed. A lot of them seem really healthy. I want to know about what's the other side of this stress response. So he started studying Tibetan monks, and he got a lot of flack for it. They stuffed him in a little back lab, and they tried to get rid of him. So he persevered because he was getting really interesting data from these monks. And what he learned over the years was that mindfulness, meaning attending to repetitive focus, the breathing or what have you, or a certain image, turned out to be profoundly restorative. Decreased blood pressure, decreased chronic hypertension, decreased insulin resistance, helped restructure the brain, improved genetic expression. But he had to fight a long time to get there. And so some of the mechanics of what he figured out over the years are that mindfulness and the relaxation response, they reboot control back from the midbrain up to the cortex. So if you imagine that our responses over the years that allowed the midbrain to run the show sort of set the stage for the problem, then you can also imagine if you can be in a state of mindfulness more and more often, you can start to reallocate, fire together, wire together that frontal cortex and kind of put it back in charge. Also, the relaxation response turns on the parasympathetic side of the autonomic, or what we're going to call the automatic nervous system. And that goes down and it says to the adrenals, hey adrenals, why don't you just release enough cortisol and too much? And that's why I've drawn them in blue for this slide and put little happy adrenal faces by them. And then one other really cool thing that happens with the relaxation response is that it turns on the vagus nerve. And so that parasympathetic nervous system, including the vagus nerve, that's the brake. And the really cool thing about the vagus nerve as the brake on all this fight or flight, wired, edgy, anxious stuff, is that it's activated immediately and you take a big breath. So if you just stop with me for a moment, and you don't even need to close your eyes, and you can keep your mouth open or closed, but if you just take a slow breath in, and a slow breath out, and this next one will add a little mindfulness. So just attend to the feeling of the air as it comes in, how it feels, and attend to the feeling as it goes out. One more breath in, and breath out. So as shocking as it sounds, thank you for doing that with me, you just activated your vagus nerve. And for any of you that noticed, just for that brief moment, whatever you were thinking about what you had to do when you get home, or maybe how you've already been sitting for half an hour, sort of goes away just a little bit. And that's because these principles that help us reverse and change course are not expensive, they're not remote, they're right there within our reach. So some really good news on that. So let's briefly talk about mindfulness, which certainly includes meditation, but meditation isn't the only mindfulness. And the most important thing I want you to know is that it's non-denominational. And I've had people say to me over the years, well, I can't meditate because I'm not a Buddhist. And I just want you to know we're really, really far past that point in terms of what you're talking about. Sociology, common sense, medical community, what the research is showing, etc. So when I talk with you a little later about Insight Timer, in case you want to get this app for your phone that's got guided meditation, I just want you to know that there are certainly some Eastern traditions that are the origin of some of these mindfulness practices. There are a lot of Christian traditions that have devotional practices which have a huge, huge component of mindfulness. Thomas Merton is a Christian that did a lot of work around that concept. And then there's a whole bunch of science around mindfulness that basically has nothing to do with spirituality at all, including Herb Benson's work. And so the nice part is that, again, I'm not a theologian, I'm a physician, but I just want you all to have the reassurance that tonight's presentation isn't a veiled pitch for Buddhism. And again, tonight's presentation isn't about religion. And so anybody from any background, whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, atheism, agnosticism, can benefit from mindfulness from a clinical science perspective. And similarly, those of you that have devotional practices and strong spiritual beliefs are very well positioned to intensify your devotion and your spiritual practices via mindfulness. So I would hope that you would find it neutral and beneficial relative to your spiritual beliefs. All right, it's time to look at a little video.
I think there are three principal PR problems around meditation. First is people think it's nonsense. They think it's only for hippies and weirdos and people who, gorge on kale and things like that. And I think that's just demonstrably untrue because of all of the science in recent years that has shown, I think, in a pretty convincing way that meditation is really good for you. It can lower your blood pressure and boost your immune system and literally rewire key parts of your brain. We're now seeing people meditating in executive suites, on military bases, in locker rooms, and for pro sports teams, in newsrooms. At my company, ABC News, we have a meditation room. So that is one myth that we can thoroughly debunk. The second myth is that people think I don't have time for this. And I would say that you have 5 minutes. Everybody's got 5 minutes. I don't care if you have 27 jobs and 14 kids. You've got 5 minutes a day. And that's really, in my view, all you need to start with. 5 to 10 minutes a day. And on crazy, crazy days, just do 1 minute. I think as long as you can keep your foot in the game, I don't know if that's a mixed metaphor, but as long as you can do something every day, as long as you have this collision with the jerk in your head who's giving you terrible ideas every day, then you are better able to fend off its terrible suggestions. And the third myth is that and this is the biggest one, people say, okay, I get it, I should do this, but you don't understand, my mind is so busy, I can't clear the mind. So the good news and the bad news is you're not special. Welcome to the human condition. Everybody's mind is busy. I call this the fallacy of uniqueness. People think that their mind is somehow uniquely busy. It's just not true. everybody's mind is this way. This is your birthright, for better or worse. And so the goal of meditation is not to clear the mind. That's not going to happen unless you're enlightened or dead. The point of meditation is to focus the mind for a few nanoseconds at a time on whatever it is you're meditating on. Usually it's your breath, the feeling of your breath coming in and going out. You just want to focus for a few nanoseconds. Then you're going to get lost. You're going to start thinking about, what am I going to have for lunch? Do I need a haircut? Why does Dances with Wolves beat Goodfellas for Best Picture in 1991? Whatever. And then the whole point is to just notice when you've gotten lost and to start over. And over and over and over 1,000,000 times.
So what we see in the functional medicine clinic is that there are a lot of things that work really well for adrenal fatigue. There are a lot of things that work really well for anxiety. A game changer is mindfulness. And we want you to know, if you have a smartphone, which is probably 98% of people in the room, you can get a free app called Insight Timer. And it has about 4,000 guided meditations. And they're as short as 1 minute or as long as an hour and a half or longer. I'll tell you right up front, some of them are odd. And hey, there's 4,000, so some of them are bound to be a little strange, right? But there's so much good stuff that you can do. It's called Insight Timer. Again, it's free. It's non-denominational. There's Christian meditations. There's Buddhist. There's non-denominational. On and on. You name it. Just a huge variety. And so many people have put so much time into putting some really good stuff there. Names you'll recognize, names you haven't heard. You can search. So you can do it under how to get to sleep, anxiety. Some of them are just certain music that's helpful, etc. So if you want to check that out, I encourage it. We encourage patients at the Functional Medicine Clinic to do about 15 or 20 minutes of this sort of thing 5 to 7 days a week, and 1 to 2 minutes here and there if you're stressed or you're about to be stressed. The related concepts are to say, well, okay, if that's not going to work for you, how about 10 breaths? So if you want to play with this, anytime you have the time, whether you're relaxed and you want to try a little mindfulness, or you feel like, oh, I wasn't really into that, but maybe I will try it right now, then basically just try to get into a comfortable position, eyes open or closed, take 10 slow breaths, and just attend to how it feels. Breathe in and out. Just pay attention to the feeling of the air moving through your nose or mouth. And then see what happens. See if you feel more clear and focused. See if you feel a little more relaxed, a little less stressed, a little better energy. And if you say, well, you know what, that's not for me, take one. Take just one slow breath from time to time and see what that does for you. Just one nice deep breath. So I'll briefly mention 2 cases we had, just so you can see how this would kind of play out in functional medicine. I had a case 3 years ago, a woman who was a personal trainer, and she was getting more and more tired, and her thyroid had checked out normal from a regular physician, and her blood cell count was fine, and she wasn't depressed, and she was just getting increasingly wiped out. And so for understandable reasons, she thought a functional medicine doctor might be able to help her figure this out. So we checked out her. I should tell you, historically, one of the things that was happening for this person is that she was doing really intense levels of CrossFit style stuff about 5 days a week, including teaching it, and she was running big time endurance events like double marathons, go on 100 or 200 miles on her bike in competition, and doing triathlons. So she was asking a lot of her body. So the part we won't talk about tonight is she was generating massive oxidative stress related to all this exercise. She did have a lot of inflammation, and we had to get on top of that too. But what her adrenals showed was stage 2 adrenal dysfunction. So she had high cortisol, low DHEA. And she was so deeply entrenched in that picture, we had to get her rolling on mindfulness. She was already game for yoga, which does many of the same things, but she really re-embraced yoga, put it back into her routine. She had to back off significantly on the intensity of her exercise. We put her onto adaptogenic botanicals, and we did get a chance to talk about those tonight, because if you're going to investigate those, I'd rather you do it with somebody you trust. We certainly do that at our clinic. But she took rhodiola in the morning, and she took ashwagandha in the evening. And then actually she needed a little DHEA because, again, she was so stuck. I put her on safe amounts of DHEA as a professional grade supplement. You can use 25 or 50 milligrams as a physician if you watch it closely, which I did. And then when people are using DHEA, we want to check their estrogen and testosterone and DHEA levels every 3 to 6 months until they can wean back off. And over the course of about a year, she got her energy back, which was a delight to her because her ability to do her job and be a happy, healthy mother was at risk. So she was delighted with her outcome on that. The second person I took care of, healthcare professional, and a person who I would call sort of a purist. And what I mean by that is not only was she very, very uninterested in medication, but she was very, very uninterested in supplementation. And so what she came to me for was lifestyle behavioral changes. What can I do to get this figured out and get better? So we checked her cortisol profile, and she also had stage 2, really impressive cortisol elevations and a really low DHEA. She did a lot of other testing with me, checked out thyroid function, did a blood cell count, did a complex history, and I came up with this very elegant plan that I was very proud of, and I thought it was really smart, and she pitched the whole thing in the toilet. So what happened? Well, it really bothered her, this idea that she was doing too much. And when she heard that, it just felt like, no, that doesn't add up. And so when that didn't register, and given that the rest was pretty distasteful and involved supplements, and Shirley took pretty good care of herself, she disappeared. And I felt like, wow, basically I'd like to help all my patients if I could. And so I assumed over the course of a year that she was probably still suffering and struggling, and I asked myself, could I have approached her a different way? Did I put her off by trying to get too much done too soon? So I ran into her husband, and I asked how she was doing. And he said, oh yeah, she's doing great. I said, really, what happened? And he said, well, about 3 months after that visit with you, she was looking at that cortisol profile again, and she just said, yeah, I'm doing too much. And she, as a healthcare professional and as a committed community person and just a dynamo, basically, just a whirlwind of positive activity, she basically had to say, I can't do all of this every day. And so she just modified her output. And he reported to me that she was 90% back to normal and delighted. So, interesting case. I want to show you just a couple of other things that can be very helpful. Made a pitch for mindfulness. That's probably the single most potent thing you can do. I'll show you here the matrix. So this is the Institute for Functional Medicine Matrix. This is how we think of cases. You can see off to the left, we want to know the predisposing factors, the antecedents, how people got to where they are. You want to think about triggers. You want to think about what mediates or perpetuates either success or trouble. And then the white area, you think about mental issues, emotional issues, spiritual issues, gut function, immunoinflammatory, energy supply for the power plants of the cells, or whether or not they're impaired, whether the person's detox is intact, how their heart and blood vessels are doing, what their communication systems are doing, whether they have good structural integrity in their joints or their gut barrier or their cell membranes. But the bottom part is what I want you to think about for the day in terms of, okay, I went to this presentation hoping to hear from this guy what I could do about fatigue and anxiety. And I just want you to know there's data to support all 5 of those on the bottom. If you get more sleep, you're going to be less anxious and you're going to have better energy. That could be going to bed a little earlier, some sleep hygiene, maybe letting go of some of the digital stuff in your sleep environment. Exercise and movement, tons of data that just walking every day is as effective an anxiolytic as a serotonin reuptake inhibitor drug. Nutrition, if you have the things in your food that your brain needs, and your food doesn't have the things in it that dampen and make your brain unhappy, it's more capable of rebooting. Stress management, getting on top of those stresses, whether it's changing the stressors themselves or your response to it. And then relationships, remembering to talk to your friend or your brother or your son or your wife or your dog about how you're doing, or hanging out with a community of people that care about you that maybe you've not attended to as much, or looking out for somebody else. And so all of those modifiable personal lifestyle factors are good for your perceived stress, they're good for your anxiety level, and they're good for your adrenals. All right, just one more thing before we switch to some questions and answers. If we could go back to the zebra. So I wanted people to know that tonight's presentation and all of our presentations are not trying to drum up business for the Functional Medicine Clinic. We are delighted to see you, we're delighted to help you, but we're not doing the presentations to try to get you to come to our clinic. Having said that, if you'd like to, we're delighted to serve you because we work for the hospital and the hospital's here for the community, and we're happy to help you. So I do want you to know some of this gets pretty complicated, and we see and deal with this all day, every day. When I have men come in and ask me whether or not they have enough testosterone, I tell them, well, we better check out your adrenals. When I have women say their cycle's out of whack, I say, well, we better check out your adrenals. When I have people come in and say, I'm tired, I say, well, we better get a good questionnaire on you, get a blood cell count, check out your thyroid function, check out your adrenals. So we do this all day, every day. We love it. Really helps, really matters. We have a handout you can take home with you tonight if you don't have it already on the relaxation response, so you can learn more about Kurt Benson's principle. And again, if you take the time to fill out the survey card, we're not fishing for compliments. If there's part of the presentation that didn't serve your needs, we want to know about it. We don't take it personally. If there's things you like, we'd love to know about that so we can keep doing it. If you tell us topics you're interested in, then we'll make it the topic of the next presentation. Autumn will be the next time that we do this. Probably going to try to do this. Skip summer months, probably skip December, but we expect to be able to do this about 8 times a year-ish. And again, tonight's topic was chosen by you all last time. I think there's a really high likelihood this autumn we'll do a talk about trying to stabilize and reverse early dementia with functional medicine. So, all right. So thanks so much. We'll wrap it up for now. I'll be around a little longer. Delighted to be here this evening.